From cartridges to floppy disks to CDs and more, video games have been released on a variety of formats over the years. But have you ever wondered what was the final game ever released on each of these formats? Join me for today's video as we explore this topic. Some outdated formats are still being used for homebrews and limited run releases, but that won't be my focus. While I may shout out some of these releases, I'm focusing primarily on the last commercially released games at the end of each format's mainstream life cycle. For our first format, we're going to look at the early days of dedicated consoles. Some of the very first video game systems started out by having the games built directly into the consoles themselves. The Magnavox Odyssey, released in 1972, is one of the earliest examples. Games were stored directly on its internal circuitry. Another popular line of systems with a dedicated library of games was the Coleco Telstar. Coleco released variations of these consoles during the mid to late 1970s. Among the last of these was the Telstar Marksman, released in 1978. It featured 6 built-in games, namely tennis, hockey, handball, jai-alai, skeet, and target. Consoles with dedicated game libraries would continue to crop up over the years, such as the Game & Watch, the handheld consoles by Tiger Electronics, and various retro or flashback consoles, to name a few. However, by the late 1970s, the gaming industry would largely shift away from this model in favor of video games distributed on interchangeable media. The most popular of these for many years were mask read-only memory cartridges, commonly referred to simply as video game cartridges. The first video game system to utilize mask ROM technology was the Fairchild Channel F, released in 1976. The first cartridge released for the system was a bundle of games that included Tic-Tac-Toe, Shooting Gallery, Doodle, and Quadradoodle. Cartridges had many advantages over other forms of storage. One of these was that the games ran faster with shorter load times. They were also harder to damage and harder to pirate. However, they were also more expensive to manufacture and could not hold as much information as some other forms of media. Eventually, these downsides forced manufacturers to switch to other formats, especially as games grew in both storage size and complexity. One of the last major game systems to utilize ROM cartridges was the Nintendo 64. The final game released for the system was Tony Hawk Pro Skater 3 in 2003. The following year, on April 22, 2004, SNK would release Samurai Showdown V Special for the Neo Geo. This would mark the end of the use of mask ROM cartridges for major game consoles. However, if we turn our attention to the handheld scene, then the final holdout was the Game Boy Advance. It released Samurai Deeper Kyo in late 2008. At 32 years, mask ROM cartridges stand as the longest-running commercial game distribution format in history, at least so far. It should also be noted that a few companies continue to produce limited runs of cartridges for older systems today, such as the NES, SNES, and more. A recent example would be the company that owns the Atari brand, which has released games that work on the Atari 2600 as recently as 2024. I can already hear the angry clicking of keyboards and tapping of screens, ready to light up the comments with cries of, "What about the Switch?" Listen, while the Nintendo Switch uses a similar type of cartridge, it uses different technology to store game data. So, before you come after me in the comments, just be patient. I'll talk about those cartridges a little later. Did you know that some early video games were stored on cassette tape? Some consoles even based their entire name on it, such as the CassetteVision in Japan, which was released in 1981. Cassettes started being used for video games around the same time as ROM cartridges in the mid-1970s. One of the first known games to be widely distributed on cassette tape was Star Trek, a text-based strategy game released in 1976. While cassettes were a popular and cheap method to distribute video games, they did have several downsides. This included being fragile and unreliable, having slower load times, and a lower storage capacity, among other issues. Pinpointing the final commercially released game on this medium is a little tricky. In my research, I found two possible candidates, the first of which was Lemmings. This game was released for the Commodore 64 in 1993. It's hard to believe that video games were still being released on cassette tapes just 1 year before the debut of the PlayStation 1. What's even crazier is that cassettes were still popular on the gaming scene in Poland well into the late 90s. One source I came across mentioned a game called Tech Blast, published by a company called Seekersoft. It was released around 1998 for the Atari 8-bit XL/XE series of home computers. This game is considered a demake of Hudson Soft's Dynablaster, perhaps better known by most as Bomberman. The next format we'll discuss is flat, disc-shaped, and has a hole in the middle. That's right, the vinyl record, which you are all just now learning was an actual thing in video gaming. Yep, it really happened. Video games were once distributed using records that could be downloaded to your home computer using a standard turntable. Move over, Beatles. These record-like discs were as thin as a sheet of paper and were known as flexi discs. They began to be distributed as inserts in various magazines in the early 1980s. I couldn't find a lot of information on this topic, and the medium didn't gain a lot of traction as a means to store and play video games. In fact, the recommended method to play these games was to transfer the flexi disc data onto a cassette tape first, and then to play the game from the cassette. The last game that I could find that was released on the flexi disc was the Thompson Twins Adventure in 1984, though it's possible there were others that came out after it. The game was distributed on FlexiDisc as a freebie in the October 1984 issue of Computer and Video Games magazine. To learn more about this fascinating format, I recommend hopping over to Carrie's channel after this video. There, she demonstrates how to download and play games from this little-known disc format. A more common format for video games on computers was the floppy disk. The floppy disk underwent several changes over the years, starting with the 8-inch floppy. This format wasn't very practical for gaming and doesn't feature a huge library of video games. It's difficult to know exactly when games began to be released on this disk type, but it's thought to be sometime in the mid to late 1970s. The last game to be released for this disc format might have been AU Densetsu Saga in 1984. It was released for the Japanese-based NEC PC 9801, among other platforms. Early models of the PC 9801 or PC 98 supported 8-inch disk drives. While the game was released primarily on other disk formats, I did find one source that claims it was released for the 8-inch floppy disk as well. There may have been other releases after this, but information on this format is spotty at best. If you or someone you know had a copy of this game on the 8-inch floppy format, please comment and let me know. A much more popular and durable method of storing video games was the 5.25-inch floppy disk. One of the first widely distributed games on this format was thought to be Colossal Cave Adventure in 1979. The format would go on to have a roughly 15-year run in video games, and the library of games being released on this disc type dwindled each year from 1990 onward. Doom would go on to be released in December of 1993. While it was primarily released on the successor to this format, it could still be purchased on 5.25-inch floppy disks via mail order into 1994. It was considered one of the last major commercial releases on this format. Copies of the game on these discs are extremely rare, however, with a full set selling for hundreds of dollars today. With that said, if we're focusing on the last of the last, then Tech Blast once again takes the crown. In addition to being released on cassette tape in 1998, it was also released on the 5.25-inch floppy disk that same year in parts of Europe. Finally, one of the last iterations of the floppy disk was the 3.5-inch flavor, also known as a stiffy in South Africa to distinguish them from their more flexible 5.25-inch counterparts. Sure, zip disks would eventually come along with 80 times the storage capacity, but they were used more for data backup and were never really used to commercially distribute video games. So, The 3.5-inch version is our final stop for this format. This disc was first introduced in 1981, and one of the first commercially released games for the format might have been Door Door. It was released in Japan in 1983 for the NEC PC-8801, as that market was one of the first to embrace this new technology. Though superior to the 5.25-inch floppy disk in many ways, the two technologies existed alongside each other for much of their lifespans. In November of 1996, Command & Conquer Red Alert was released on the good old Stiffy. This version was released on 14 to 16 high-density 3.5-inch floppies, depending on localization. To fit the game on these discs, it had to omit or heavily compress most of the full-motion video cutscenes. They also had to delete some of the soundtrack or replace it at parts with the MIDI versions instead. This would mark the last major video game released on this format. However, in early 1997, a demo of the game Blood was released across a 3-disc set on the 3.5-inch floppy. After that, there were a handful of educational games released on this format over the next couple of years, but no major video games outside of fan projects and pirated copies. Floppy disks were simply too limited in their storage capacity as games grew increasingly more complex. As such, a new medium was needed to address the ever-growing storage needs of modern video games. And so, we turned to yet another flat, disc-shaped format with a hole in the middle, only a little shinier. That's right, the Laserdisc. It should be noted that the format used for video games was slightly different than the standard Laserdisc, which was used mainly for movies. The Mega LD and LD-ROM were the formats used for video game Laserdiscs, as they allowed for a hybrid storage of information. The game data would be encoded digitally, while the video would still be stored as analog. By contrast, standard Laserdiscs were analog only. Laserdiscs were used mainly in arcades, but there's some debate about the first arcade machine to use this format. Some sources point to a game called Quarter Horse in 1981. A more widely recognized candidate is Astrobelt, which hit arcades in 1983. Eventually, Laserdiscs would briefly make their way into the home video game scene with the Pioneer Laser Active released in 1993. It was known as the NEC LD-ROM system in Japan. One of the final video games for the Laser Active, and thus the Laserdisc format itself, was Goku, an educational game that came out in June 15th, 1995, on the Mega LD format. It was also re-released on October 20th, 1995, for the LD-ROM format. It involved guiding the Dragon Ball Z character Goku through the 7 wonders of the ancient world. 3D Virtual Australia was released for the NEC in 1996. Both of these titles were video games in the loosest sense of the word, and could probably be better described as an interactive multimedia experience. Laserdiscs started disappearing from arcades around this time as well. While it was an interesting format that offered several advantages, the console cost around $970 USD at the time, which is close to $2,000 today. And if you wanted to completely trick it out with all of the many add-ons, then that brought the price up to almost $3,000 USD, which is $6,300 today. That's an eye-watering price tag, especially for a Canadian like me. This was part of the reason why the Laserdisc never really caught on for home gaming, or in general for that matter. Thus, a cheaper alternative was needed. Enter the CD-ROM. Video game developers started experimenting with games on CD-ROM in the 1980s. And in 1988, NEC would launch the PC Engine CD. The first 2 games released for this system was a Street Fighter clone known as Fighting Street and a dating simulator called No Rico in December 1988. These are widely credited as being among the first games launched on this format. CDs would go on to be popular for many years on both home consoles and PCs. Though loading times could be a bit slow, they could handle complex games and were cheap to produce. The final major game released on CD was Call of Duty 2 in 2005. Like the floppy disk before it, it came out at a time when storage needs of video games were quickly outgrowing this format, and COD2 required several CDs to run. I should also note that a company called Big Fish Games was still releasing games on CDs as recently as 2014, but these were smaller budget games, usually point-and-click adventures. The last game released by them were Awakening, The Sunhook Spire, Puppet Show, Destiny Undone, and Dark Parables, Final Cinderella, all of which came out in late 2014. This would all but mark the end of video games being commercially released on CDs. To address the need for increased storage capacity, the DVD-Rom quickly became the new favorite in gaming. Better known simply as DVDs, they featured 7 times the storage capacity of CDs and ran much faster. This made DVD the natural successor for makers of both console and PCs, allowing for complex 3D games sporting HD graphics. Game developers began tinkering with this format in the 1990s, with one of the first game releases on DVD considered to be Blade Runner in 1997. Consoles like the PlayStation 2 and Xbox 360 would utilize this technology as well, cementing it as the de facto format in gaming for a time. One of the last major games to be released on DVD was Microsoft Flight Simulator in August of 2020. This is a massive game that came out as part of a 10 DVD set. DVD game releases had been dwindling by then, and few, if any, major games were released from 2020 onward. A new type of disc with an even greater storage capacity than DVDs had taken over the video game market by then. In 2008, Toshiba announced that they would cease the development and production of HD DVD players. This paved the way for the Blu Ray disc to become the industry standard shortly thereafter. Sony, the creator of this format, went on to release the PlayStation 3 in 2006. This was the first console to feature Blu Ray as a means by which to play video games. This means that the launch titles for the PS3 would be some of the first games released on this format. This included games like Call of Duty 3, Resistance, Fall of Man, and Marvel Ultimate Alliance, just to name a few. As of the publication of this video, games are still being released on Blu-ray. We may one day see this format dethroned, however, as we will discuss shortly. As promised earlier, we will now look at another format that started to be used alongside the technologies mentioned above. That format, of course, was non-volatile flash memory. For decades, flash memory never competed directly with CDs, DVDs, or Blu-rays, although that may soon change as I'll explain in a moment. Flash cartridges were mainly used for handheld systems, as it offered a compact way to store games. The format is like an SD card, with the exception that you can't write any new data to them. That means that it is a read-only technology like ROM cartridges, but the inner mechanics are quite different, kind of like comparing CDs to Blu-ray discs. That's why I gave it its own separate category. While not exactly like mask ROM technology, flash ROMs could rightly be viewed as its successor. The Neo Geo Pocket, released in 1998, was one of the first handheld consoles to use this technology to store full video games. The original Neo Geo Pocket only lasted for about 5 months before the Neo Geo Pocket Color took over, and only 9 games were ever released for the console. A total of 6 games were released at launch in October of 1998, namely Baseball Stars, King of Fighters R1, Melon Chan's Growth Diary, Neo Geo Cup 98 Plus, Pocket Tennis, and Puzzle Link. These would be the first games ever released on flash game cartridges. It's also the technology powering the game cartridges for the Nintendo Switch today, meaning we haven't yet seen the last game to be released on this format either. The Switch 2 is expected to carry on with the use of flash memory for their game cartridges, but with an interesting twist. While some games will be available on the cartridges themselves, other cartridges will act more as game key cards. In other words, these cartridges act as more of an authentication key or ticket that lets you download the full game to the system's internal storage. You will still need the cartridge to be inserted to play the game, but the bulk of the game's data will live on the console rather than the cartridge. This has some advantages as it will allow publishers to develop games larger than the rumored 64GB storage capacity of the Switch 2 flash cartridges. Games purchased using this method will thus be a hybrid of flash cartridge coupled with the console's own internal storage. This brings us to our next popular medium for delivering video games to us, and that would be the consoles themselves. Digital downloads and streaming via an internet connection seem to be the new norm when it comes to playing modern video games. In fact, some systems, like the Xbox S and PlayStation 5 Digital, don't even allow the option of playing games on physical media. Games on these consoles are stored exclusively on or streamed directly to the console itself. This means that, in some ways, we're starting to come full circle and return to the early days of gaming with dedicated consoles like the early Telstar systems from the 70s.
Ironic.
The big difference now, however, is that unlike the early dedicated consoles, we now have the option to expand our games library. Computers too are following this trend, as few pre-built PCs include optical disk drives nowadays. And since most, if not all, modern consoles and PCs use solid-state drives, which is just another form of flash memory, it might mean that this format will one day dominate the video game landscape and could eventually dethrone Blu Ray as the preferred method of playing games. This is especially true as solid state drives grow in storage capacity and become cheaper to manufacture. That, or we'll all eventually be streaming our games from the cloud over an internet connection rather than having physical or digital collections of them. Like most things these days, it means that streaming might be the format to dethrone all others. However, this begs the question that many have been asking these days. That question is, do we truly own the games we purchase, or just the ticket or key that allows us to access those games? Philippe Tremblay, a director at Ubisoft, said that as a gamer, you need to start feeling comfortable with not owning your game. He makes the point that it's already happened with music and movies, as many of us have traded in our CDs, DVDs, and Blu-rays for streaming subscriptions. Will this soon be the new reality for video games as well? Perhaps that question is best addressed in another video. If you've made it this far, thank you for watching. And if you know of any other major commercially released games for the formats that happened after the ones I mentioned in the video, please comment and let me know. Also, please don't forget to hit like, subscribe, and help my small channel grow. I hope you enjoyed, and I'll see you all in the next video. Thank you. Bye-bye.